For Sarah, double duty.
Our first scripture today is from Deuteronomy chapter 34, beginning at verse 1 and going through verse 12. Now Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the Negev, and the territory in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab, in accordance with the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his burial place to this day. Isn't that going to be fun on resurrection morning? When Moses comes up from somewhere. Nobody knows where. Although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eyesight was not dim, nor had his vigor left him. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands on him. And the sons of Israel listened to him, and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. And then turn with me, if you will, to Psalm 90, which is a psalm written by Moses. Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man back into dust and say, "Return, O children of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night. You've swept them away like a flood. They fall asleep. In the morning they are like grass which sprouts anew. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening it fades and withers away. For we've been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we've been dismayed. You've placed our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days have declined in your fury. We have finished our years like a sigh. As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength, 80. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for it's soon gone, and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger and your fury according to the fear that is due you? So, teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. Do return, O Lord, how long will it be? And be sorry for your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your loving kindness, that we may sing for joy and be glad all of our days. Make us glad according to the days you've afflicted us, and the years we've seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants, and your majesty to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm for us the work of our hands. Psalm 90 contains passages that are very familiar to many of us. We're accustomed to hearing that God has been our dwelling place for all generations. That's comforting. We know that from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. We sing, and we're going to sing today, 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone. And these are beautiful passages about the eternal nature of our God. We're less familiar about that section in the middle that I just read, from verses 7 through 12, which refers to a time of correction that God's people have undergone. We like to forget that God has promised that he corrects those he loves. If we're honest, There's many occasions when we can identify with the way the psalmist feels in verses 9 and 10, when he says, "Our days have declined in thy fury. We've finished our years like a sigh." And often we relate to the part of the verse 10 that laments that our lives are labor and sorrow and are soon gone. The psalmist, who in this case is Moses, faces these discouraging thoughts with a prayer which begins in verse 12. The entire psalm is a prayer, but I want to focus just on the last part, beginning at verse 12 in Psalm 90. Moses has celebrated God's eternal nature, and he has bemoaned our transitory nature when he says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may present to thee a heart of wisdom." Teach us to number our days. That sounds depressing, doesn't it? I go, okay, I've got another 10. How many? It doesn't sound like a positive thing to do. But that's not the flavor of this song. It's not a depressing song. There is the part about life going by too fast, for sure. But there's also that dwelling place verse that speaks of God as our security and a rock that outlasts all of us. Verse 14 speaks of satisfying us in the morning with loving kindness and singing for joy and be glad all of our days. I must confess that there were days this week when I was hurting physically and I did not sing with joy. And I was not glad all day until I could get back in bed at night. But I believe that the secret to a contented life is found in verses 16 and 17 of Psalm 90. Moses asked the Lord for 4 things in these verses. And I truly believe that we should make this the focus of our own prayers as individuals and also as a church. Okay, the first thing he asks is, "Let thy work appear to thy servants." That you could just go right by that. Let thy work appear to thy servants. Psalm 44:1 gives us a little more insight into what that means. "O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us the work that thou didst in their days, in the days of old." Okay, so we want the work of God to appear to his servants, the work that he's done in days of old. Then Psalm 77:12 continues the thought. It says, "I will meditate on all thy work and muse on thy deeds." In Psalm 92:4 and 5 finish the thought, "For thou, O Lord, hast made me glad by what thou hast done. I will sing for joy," there it is, "at the works of thy hands. How great are thy works, O Lord. Thy thoughts are very deep." All of these ideas about God's works in the past, about meditating on his work, musing upon it, and then singing for joy at it, these are all contained in Moses' plea to let thy works appear to thy servants. First, we need to know what God has done. And that includes knowing salvation history, which we're pretty strong on. It also means knowing how God has moved to bring us life and hope as a people. It includes knowing how God has worked in and through us as a denomination, as a church, and as individuals. It doesn't stop, and that's the point where I think we run into trouble. It doesn't stop with knowing what God has done. Many of us could recite that. But it continues to meditating upon it. When you meditate upon God's work, it does indeed make us glad and able to sing for joy. Now, too often when we start thinking about what God has done, especially in the past, our focus is just that little bit off. Instead of focusing on God and God's work in the past, we focus on how things used to be in the past, which they're not necessarily the same. And it can make us sad that things are not the way that they once were, can't it? This week, one of my childhood friends lost her mother. And she started texting me, and she had been to Clovis and had pictures of the Clovis church, and it was really interesting to see it. But it took the two of us to a time of great nostalgia as we remembered being 9-year-olds who became friends there. And my brother and I talked many times about we would run across that lawn between the church and the parsonage, and Daddy would pretend to be racing us. In retrospect, I know that's what was happening. But it seemed like the hugest expanse of lawn that we were going across. And when I see grown-up pictures of when I had been there at the old church and seen that, it was a teeny, tiny little yard. And my friend said the same thing. She said, those houses seem they're so tiny. But at the time, they certainly didn't seem so. But nostalgia is kind of a fun thing to wallow in a little bit. But on its own, nostalgia can make you thankful for the past, but it does not give you grace for today. Because if today doesn't look like the things that you remember so nostalgically, you don't have a place to put it. Is that making sense to anybody? Are you dead? Nostalgia is kind of fun. It's bittersweet. It can be, and we have a lot of good memories. But it doesn't lead to joy. Because if today is not as good as we perceive yesterday was, it doesn't lead to joy. I think that's why Moses doesn't say, let us remember how good the past was. Moses says, let your work appear to your servants. Not to focus on just how things were and what was fun and what was good, but specifically, what did God do? And when we think about that, that's different. We need to pray in this church and for ourselves that God shows us both in our memories and in our present circumstances when he was and when he is at work. Most of us can talk about, yeah, here's what God did in the past. Can we talk about what God is doing right now today in our church? If we can't, we need to be asking God to show us that. According to what Moses is saying here, let your work appear to your servants. When we ponder what his hand has done and is doing, that's when gladness and joy will well up. And there is much hope there. Because God is no different than God was when I was that 9-year-old. God is no different than he was when you came to faith. God is no different than he was when this church had 120 people in it back in the 60s or whatever that was. God's no different. We need to see what he is doing. And that's where the joy and gladness will come from. When God is the one working, our weakness means little. Even if we've been here and we've gotten older, and we all have, everybody who's here, gotten older and we have a hard time feeling like we can do the things we used to do, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't. When God is the one at work, he will do what he wants to do. He can do what he will, even through those who may feel that their days have declined and their lives currently feel like a sigh. So the first thing he asked was, let your work appear to your children, to your servants. Second thing he asks is that God let his majesty appear to his servants' children. Let his majesty appear to his servants' children. I have never heard a prayer like that in my life. Not once. Parents pray a lot of things for their children. They pray for safety. They pray for wisdom. They pray that their children will come to know the Lord. They pray lots of things, good things for their children. But I don't know, I'm not a parent, but I don't know if they also pray that God's majesty will appear to their children. I don't even know exactly what that would look like. But I am convinced that we as a church should be asking God to show us his majesty. I don't care if there's 6 of us here, 30, 70, we need to be asking God to show us his majesty, because that's the point. I followed up the cross references in my Bible to see what this majesty could be, and it led me to 2 interesting passages. The first one is in 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 11. This is the passage that describes the dedication of the temple under Solomon. And leading up to it is the description of who's there and how they brought the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, all of those things. You've read the passage. Then in verse 10 it tells us, it came about when the priest came from the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Now, I've not been praying that God shows you his majesty. I'll confess. I doubt if you've been praying that for me either. We don't ask God to let us see his majesty and his glory. And you could say, and you may, that, well, that was an isolated event in the Old Testament. That's not going to happen on a given Sunday. Okay? God's glory isn't like that today. Well, maybe. But my other cross-reference to this passage, and think about this because I'm going to say something different about this passage than what we're used to. The other cross-reference in this passage took me to Isaiah 6 in verse 3. Now, some of you already recognize that this is the passage that tells Isaiah's vision. The day when he saw the Lord high and lifted up, with his train filling the temple. Verse 3 tells us that one of the seraphim called out to one another and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The whole earth. The pew next to you. Under the pew beside you. The whole earth is full of his glory. So if the whole earth is full of the glory of God, and Isaiah saw a true picture of what was going on, and the seraphim was telling the truth, and I feel like they were, then we are surrounded by the glory of God. No matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, we are surrounded by it, but we just can't see it. If we could, what difference would it make to us? If we could see the majesty of God, if we could see his glory, how much more inspired lives would we live if we were aware? Who was the poet that said, "Every blade of grass"? Mandela, help me out.
Whitman.
Whitman
is my guess. Walt Whitman.
It might be, yeah. Every blade of grass is a testimony or something like that. But that's the truth. Everything around us testifies to the glory of God. The homeless person on the street corner is a testament to the glory of God. We just have to ask God to show us how. Okay? I believe that when Moses wrote this prayer song, he was praying for his people, Israel. He was getting ready to die. He was praying for them. They had wandered in labor and sorrow for a long time, and I think he was longing for them to be able to see God's work and God's majesty, so they could indeed be joyful and productive and number their days appropriately. It's so easy to just put one foot in front of the other and keep going and not recognize that each day is a day that you have been given to invest, a day that is a gift to be used in the service of God and to celebrate his glory. It stuns me still that this is my 34th year teaching in the same school. If you'd asked me 34 years ago, how long do you think you'll be there? I had no concept. But you just keep going and going and going. And don't get me wrong, I've loved it. But it's so easy for our lives to just pass without paying attention to the glory that is there. Moses knew what he was talking about this whole glory thing. Remember, he was the one who asked God to let him see him. Everybody else was terrified of that. And God hid him in the cleft of the rock so that he would be safe enough to see God's back as he passed by. Because you couldn't see all of God and live. But he put Moses in a safe place where he could just see a glimpse. Moses is also the one who met with God in a special way to receive the law. Moses is not Charlton Heston, but we all have that picture in our mind of him on the mountaintop. But that really happened. That was a real man meeting with God. And as we learned last week, Joshua wouldn't leave the tent of meeting afterwards. That was pretty cool. I had never noticed that before. Remember when Moses would come down from the mountain and how he would cover his face? Why? So the Israelites wouldn't see the glory fading, because he had been so touched and marked by the glory of God, but as he got farther away, it would fade. How did seeing God's glory affect Moses? His obituary, which we read a little while ago, says, now Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated. And further, since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Now, I'm not promising you that if we see God's glory and majesty, we'll live to be 120 with no physical problems, although we might. I can't say it wouldn't happen if we really saw his glory like Moses did. But I am saying that living in the light of his glory and majesty will keep us from ending our lives like a sigh, and that it will give us joy and gladness all of our days. We've all seen very elderly people who were still quite joyful. We've also seen very elderly people who were bitter and hateful and complaining and griping, haven't we? We've all seen that. Keeping a focus on what God has done and on his glory and majesty is going to keep us from ending our lives that way, like a sigh, and it will give us joy and gladness all our days. So we need to pray that for ourselves and for each other, that God's majesty would appear to us. First thing in the morning, we get out of bed. Lord, show me your majesty. Show it to my friends. Show it to others at the church today. So the first thing was show them your work. The second thing was show them your majesty. The third thing is Moses asked God to let his favor be upon us. Now I have friends of the more charismatic persuasion, and they believe that this means God should prosper everything we do. Give us favor, Lord, they'll pray. When they're talking about business meals maybe too, I don't know. Business deals, interviews, even, and this one flies all over me, finding good parking places. Lord, give us favor as we're looking for a parking place. It's like, it just flies all over me. The idea is kind of a spiritual nepotism. It's this idea that because we're God's, we should get all the good stuff. And that's kind of the idea. But I'm not sure that's exactly the kind of favor Moses is talking about here. It's more the favor of fellowship and access. Psalm 27:4 tells us, "One thing I've asked from the Lord, and that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty, i.e. majesty of the Lord, and to meditate in his temple." The favor God gives us is the privilege of being close to him, being in his temple all the time, never being unclean and unable to be there. In the Jewish temple period, there were many things that kept one from being able to be in the temple. Contact with death. If you had been taking care of someone and they died, you couldn't go to the temple until you were cleansed. Illness, menstruation, childbirth, any number of things could keep you from being able to go to the temple without special cleansing. The psalmist is asking for the favor of always being in the temple, that he can't get unclean, is what he's saying. And that favor has been granted to us in Jesus. It has. We can now come boldly to the throne of grace, knowing that we will obtain mercy. We can also be in his presence as often as we want to. Now, I don't know that this equates directly to being in church. I know most of us would say, I like church, but I don't want to dwell there all the days of my life. And sometimes being a pastor's kid, I felt like I did dwell there all the days of my life growing up. And maybe that's not exactly what it means, but I do believe that it means it's indicative of the fact, this attitude is indicative of the fact that we have not been seeing God's glory and majesty. If we were, I think sleeping in or any other thing that we wanted to do would not be near as appealing as seeing the majesty of God. In the Old Testament period, people couldn't enter the presence of a king without an invitation. You couldn't just go knock on the door and say, "Excuse me, king, I need to talk to you." My principal has an open door policy, and as long as his door's open, you can just go in and talk to him, and I appreciate that. But, I'm not going to compare him to a king because he would never get over it. But in the Old Testament, if you were a king, people were taking literally their lives in their hands if they went to try to seek you and you had not invited them. That's why I remember the story of Esther. She was the queen, his own wife. Even though she was a queen, she couldn't enter his presence without an invitation. And that's why she was risking her life when she went to plead her people's cause. And if you remember the story, and this part always captured me in Sunday school, the king extended his golden scepter to her. That's such an interesting detail to me. He extended the golden scepter to her to say that she could come in. She was welcome. Moses prayed for God's favor. It has been granted to us in Jesus. The golden scepter is perpetually extended to us. Perpetually. We can go anytime into the presence of the King. There's no time when we cannot enter the presence and delight in his favor. How would a constant consciousness of this help us to number our days wisely? What changes would we make in our priority list if we really got that? So he asks that we be able to see his work, that we be able to see his majesty, that he grant us favor, which he has done. And the last thing that Moses asks God is that he confirm for us the work of our hands. In fact, he repeats that twice, if you notice. Confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm for us the work of our hands. Another word here for confirm is establish or give permanence to. One of the things that most makes us end our days like a sigh is to sense that what we are doing doesn't matter. And I think Moses understood that. After all, he had to walk in circles with a crowd of rebellious people for 40 years, waiting for them to die. I mean, if you break it down, that's what he was doing. And understanding that he too would die at the end of that time without reaching journey's end. It would be awfully easy to feel that the work he did was useless at that point, wouldn't it? But when God establishes the work of our hands, it has eternal significance, or can. 1 Corinthians 3, 4 through 14 discusses the value we placed on work, and there's a lot there, but verse 14 is the key. If any man's work which he has built upon remains, he shall receive a reward. Back when we studied Heaven is Not My Home, we talked a lot about the eternal significance of some earthly things. And when God establishes the work of our hands, it's not meaningless, but it's lasting and life-giving to us. You know, some people talk about the Christian life like we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's all going to be burned up and it doesn't matter anyway. But that's not the picture that the Bible gives us. Some of what we do can be established and have eternal significance. I want most of what I do to have eternal significance. When God establishes the work of our hands, it's not meaningless, but lasting and life-giving to us. Ephesians 2:10 says, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. Why? For good works. And not just any good works. So it's not a matter of sitting around and saying, okay, what good work shall I do today? For good works which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. God has prepared those good works, those permanent works, those lasting works that he wants us to walk in. We don't have to beat our heads trying to find the appropriate strategy or method to make things happen. I've been in so many church meetings where we talked about here's what we need to do to grow, lots of things like that. The reality is God's going to grow us if that's what God wants to do. We need to be obedient. We don't need to expend our energy on works that seem to have no purpose just because it's something that's been done in the past. Often things that churches do have a purpose when they begin, but the need may no longer exist 20, 30, 50 years later, and yet the activity itself has become institutionalized. And so we spend lots of energy doing something that no longer has meaning or purpose. My former principal used to like to talk about the woman who always cut the pot roast in half before cooking it. And when somebody asked her why, she said that's how her mother taught her to do it. When the mother was asked why, she said her pan was too small, so it always had to be cut. And so it began as an activity with a purpose, and it turned into an institutionalized routine that had no meaning at all. The daughter just thought, okay, when I make a pot roast, I need to cut it in half. Didn't even think why. Instead of doing what's always been done, or even trying hard to come up with a new way, what we need to do is ask God to show us the good works for our hands to do. Show us the works that you've prepared for us. I mean, do we believe that? The Bible says he created us for good works, that he's prepared for us beforehand. Do we believe it? What we need to do is ask God to show us the good works he's created for us for, and ask him to confirm and establish the works of our hands. Lord, help this not to be useless, what I'm doing right now. This thing that I'm putting so much energy into, Lord, take this and make this eternal. When he confirms that it's right, and we know he's using us for eternal purposes, we live in a sense of life and purpose. So this week we lost two great actresses. Cloris Leachman, one of my favorites. She went to college with my high school principal, who was also an actress too. And Cicely Tyson. I've listened to tributes to them, as I'm sure some of you have or read them, and to people talking about their lives well lived, and I think that they were well lived. And they will be remembered for a long time, but it would be really hard to beat the obituary of Moses. There has not arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. And the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. Now that's an obituary. And as much as I liked Cicely Tyson and Cloris Leachman, 100, 200 years from now, if time lasts, no one's going to remember them, even though they did good things. Now, Moses will still be remembered because the Lord established the work of his hands. Sometimes we may feel, or at least I do, and I'm always up here confessing all these negative emotions, so that the work we try to do for God or for this church doesn't matter. We pour out energy, creativity, effort, and the church doesn't grow, or it grows a little and then it shrinks, and it grows and it shrinks. We pour into people, and they don't stay with us, they go elsewhere. All of these things happen, and we work and struggle, and we become discouraged, and I get it. As long as I've been teaching, I've been at this church too. We're afraid that our lives, or at least the life of our church, might end like a sigh. I know you're afraid of that. And we wonder if God is really faithful, if our efforts really mean something. We can learn from Moses at this point. He ended up with a lot of wisdom. While he recognized the difficulties inherent in living life as temporal, finite people who are really blips on the radar screen of eternity, he also realized that we are rooted and established in an infinite and eternal God who has been our dwelling place for generations, since before the mountains were born, who gave birth to the world itself, and who is already at the end, waiting to crown us with immortality. We're rooted there. So our short little life is part of a much bigger story. He asked that this God, for the four things we need to live joyous, purposeful lives that do not end like a sigh. Let thy work appear to thy servants. We must ask God to show us what he's done and is doing, and we must meditate on that. Let thy majesty appear to their children. We must earnestly ask God to show us, both as individuals and as his church, his majesty and glory. Let the favor of our God be upon us. It is, and we must not take that lightly. We need grace to press into that favor, that access, that security in him. And fourth, confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm for us the work of our hands. We must ask God to show us what those works are that he has created us to do, so that we do number our days appropriately and wisely, and spend them investing in eternity, pouring out our limited resources, energy, and effort on those things that will matter most, the ones he has chosen. Only then will we sing for joy and be glad all of our days. Amen.
Amen.
Please turn in your hymnals to number 13.